Hilchos Sefer Torah, Perek Chi'i. The laws of the Torah scroll, chapter 9. Today, most of the chapter is one topic. That's what's called Orko Kehekefo. Ideally, the Torah scroll is supposed to be as long as the circumference. If you take a thread and you put it around the whole Sefer Torah as it's rolled up, that should be the length of the cloth, of the parchment. Should show the video. Here we have a Torah scroll. Pasul, this is a disqualified Torah scroll. We got permission from a rabbi to take it out. He said I have to announce that it's not kosher. Because if it's a kosher Sefer Torah, you're not allowed to take it out for nothing. But if you have a non-kosher Sefer Torah and you announce that it's non-kosher, then you can use it for learning purposes. So we're going to use this for some things. To learn it's not a kosher Torah. There was too many mistakes in it. It's an old Torah. It got faded. From our own Kodesh in Sherman Oaks, right here. If you ever notice, it's the white Torah scroll, sits in the top left corner. We take it out only once a year on Simchat Torah. We dance with it, Hakafot. But even though it's not kosher, but you can't actually use it.
It's not fixable?
No. We saw yesterday that or 2 days ago, if you have too many mistakes per column on a Torah, you can't fix it. So we don't, but we still keep it. So regardless, if the whole, so there's two opinions what it means, length like circumference. You see over here I have two pictures. One picture is like this. This is the classic understanding. If you roll the whole Torah to one side, now that thick roll has to be orko kehekefo, which means the length has to match the circumference around it. Other opinions say no. That's what orko kehekefo means. Like this, the Torah is sitting like this, and if we take a string and we wrap it around, it has to be that long as the cloth. Now the Talmud says this is a very challenging feat. Rav Huna once tried it. He made 40 Torahs. He wrote 40 full Torahs to try to get this thing, and only one of them came out to be exactly orko kehekefo. So it's very hard. Nevertheless, the Rambam sees it important enough that he spends almost a whole chapter explaining how to do it and how he did it personally. He gives us, he says, I achieved this feat, and he's going to show us how he did it. And nevertheless, the commentaries on the Rambam, they tried following the Rambam's instructions and it didn't work for them. So it seems like it's very dependent on the parchment, because if you make a parchment a little thicker or a little thinner, now you're rolling it all together, so you can miscalculate.
Or how tight you do it.
Or how tight you do it, or what kind of...
Sewing them together, overlap and sew.
Right, so he talks about the overlapping and the sewing. We'll talk about everything.
Why is it important?
Why is it important? The Talmud says, Noi Sefer Torah. It's beauty for the Torah to be this way. The only commentaries that I found, it seems to be a bit of a struggle to explain why. Some say it just doesn't look nice. I'll tell you why. If it would be too long, if you make the parchment too long, and then the Torah scroll would end up being very, very thin, so that would look very, very skinny. And then if you made it too short, it would become very, very fat. So it just wouldn't look good. So they say if you keep it around this area of our orko kehekefo, then it comes out to be Noi Sefer Torah. That's beauty, but it's a practical thing.
It's a practical thing,
Yeah.
because if there is no rule, you can do it.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, you'll do it like this. You'll do it like a mini
Somebody
Megillah.
thinks it's beautiful to do it as big as possible.
Yeah, exactly.
It's enough if you dictate the length of the parchment, that then takes care of it.
Right, so essentially that's what he's going to do. He's going to dictate the length of the parchment and the length of the columns, and then that's what's going to come out. Halacha Aleph. Ein osin sefer Torah lo orko yoter al hakefo v'lo hakefo yoter al orko. You can't make a Torah scroll with a length longer than a circumference, or the circumference longer than the length. V'kamahu orko. What is the length of a Torah scroll? By length, the Rambam means the height of the parchment. Let me see if I can just move this over here so I can show you what this means. Okay. I can only use the disqualified one, so I have to use this one. So here. Orko means the length of this. The length of the column is, says the Rambam, V'kamahu orko bigvil, if you're using unprocessed parchment, so straight off of the cow, shishat tfachim. So ideally it has to be 6 tfachim. Yeah, I tried getting some kind of a picture here, but basically, every tefach, according to Jewish law, is 4 thumb breadths, 4 finger breadths, 4 etzbaot. So if you have 6 tfachim, that's 24 etzbaot. The Rambam is going to refer to these finger measurements very soon. Shishat tfachim shehem arba ve'asrim etzbaot berochav hagudal shel yad. 6 tfachim, which is 24 finger breadths when you use the thumb. Because in Torah, when we say etzba, we mean this. We don't mean any of these fingers. We mean the measurement of the thumb, the thickness of the thumb. That's if you're using unprocessed parchment. If you make unprocessed parchment and it's 6 tfachim tall, typical math will tell you when you finish the whole Torah scroll, it's going to end up being somewhat orkoke hakefo. Okay. Ubi klaf, if you're using more processed parchment, thinner parchment, so now opachot oyoter. I can't give you an exact measurement, a little less, a little more. Again, so long as you're coming up with this condition where the length will meet the circumference. Let's say you decided to use unprocessed parchment, thicker parchment, and you say, you know what, I'm going to make a smaller Torah, pachot mishishat tfachim umi'etet haktav. I'm going to make it smaller than 6, and then I'm going to write very small. It's going to come out less columns. Or yiter al shisha v'hirchiv baktav, where I say, you know what, make it bigger than 6. I want a tall Torah. You ever see the ones from Teman, the Yemenite Torahs? These huge Torahs, much taller than 6 tfachim, and I'm going to write bigger. So it's going to come out ad sheyar koke hakefo. In the end, the length is going to cover the circumference. Harezaka mitzvah, you've done the mitzvah. The fact that the Talmud says 6 tfachim, it's an average measurement. You do whatever works for you. Halacha bet says the Rambam, there are some limitations though. And these are on the screen over here. Shiur hagilayon milamata arba etzbaot. The margin on the bottom of the Torah writing has to be 4 finger breadths, which is 1 tefach. Ulemala shalosh etzbaot. The margin on top is a bit less, 3 etzbaot. Ubein daf ledaf, between column and column, shtei etzbaot, there has to be 2 finger breadths, 1 belonging to each column. Lefichach, therefore, tzarich sheyaniach bitchilat kol yiri'ah uvesofa. At the end of every piece of parchment, and at the beginning of every piece of parchment, you have to leave rochav etzba achat ukedei tfira, enough for the space of the 1 finger breadth, plus enough to sew. You were saying before the overlap. You could see this over here. Here's the Torah. Can we see the sewing over here? Yeah. So you see the stitching. What happens is actually 2 pieces of cloth overlapped. See that? They bent it in. They just bandaged it down with these special bandages because that holds it down in place so that it doesn't flip around. But technically, it's these 2 pieces of parchment. If I open it up over here, you can see clearer. There's 2 pieces of parchment over here, right? And they've been overlapped on the back, one over the other. So now when you're looking at it, you have 1 etzba on each side. You have 1 finger breadth on each side. But before it was folded and closed, there was a bit more. You left a bit more. You left the etzba and enough to overlap for the sewing. Stehst? Yeah, pretty self-explanatory, but just wanted to show you because it's nice to have show and tell. Okay, we're going to come back to this soon.
So how many actual pieces does it calculate?
How many does it? Okay, we'll talk about it soon. There's actually a difference of opinion in specific between the Yemenites and the rest of the world today, especially. So you leave 1 etzba and enough to sew. Shenimtza, so it comes out. Kishiyitpor hayiriyah, when you're going to sew up the pieces of parchment together, yiyeh ben kol daf v'daf b'chol Sefer kulo shtei etzbaot. All throughout the entire Torah scroll is going to be 2 etzbaot between every single column. Also, this is also pretty obvious. V'yaniach mina or b'tchilat Sefer u'b'sofo. You have to leave extra leather on the beginning of the entire scroll, all the way by Bereshit, and at the end by V'zot HaBracha, you have to leave a little bit. Kedei liglol ha'amud, so it can roll over this little pole over here. This pole exists both in Ashkenazi and Sephardi Torahs. Even if you look at a Sephardi Torah where it's in a case, there's still a pole running up and down where the scroll is running around.
You could make it thinner.
Huh?
You could make that circumference of the pole. We can make it much
That's true.
thinner.
That's true. But whatever pole you're using, you have to have some extra on the hide to wrap it around. We're going to see some with sewing also. Yeah. B'chol ha'shiurina elu l'mitzvah. This is all for the ideal mitzvah, all these amounts. If you did less or more, you haven't disqualified it. Now notice the Rambam didn't give any measurement for the column itself. He says, we know how much it has to be on top of the column, on bottom of the column, and between the columns. But how wide each column is, that's going to depend on the scribe. 2 days ago we said you have to write 30 letters per column. But it's not a length. 30 letters, one guy writes big letters, one guy writes small letters. That's why this can make a lot of different issues or a lot of different variations, depending on from scribe to scribe, how long the Torah scroll will be. So the Rambam says, I'm going to give you one method. Halacha Gimel. Ketzad yitkaven adam ad sheyaseh sefer sheyeh orkoke hakefo. How can a person do his best to align that the book that he writes, the Torah scroll that he writes, which is the mitzvah to write your own Torah scroll, should be length like circumference? Matchilu merabeah ha'orot b'shaveh. What you start off with is making pieces of parchment. And you make them rectangular. It doesn't have to be square, just make create rectangular pieces of parchment. Ve'oser rochav kol or mehen shishat tfachim. And you make the width of every hide 6 tfachim. When the Rambam says width, he's referring to this way, because it's going to become the length, it's going to become the height of the Torah scroll. That's going to be the width. Each piece of parchment is rectangular, so the length is this way. That's undefined, depending on how you write, it will get longer or shorter. But the height, make it always 6 tfachim. Ketzav echad l'chol echad. One measurement for every single one. V'achar kach golel ha'orot b'shaveh. Then, before you even sew anything up, just roll them all together into one coil. Ve'oseh mehen krach echad mehudak yafeh yafeh. Make one bond, I guess is the word, or coil, tightened very, very well. Umosif ba'orot umahadek, and keep on adding as you process the parchments. Add more and more, tighten them more and more. Ad sheyaseh hekef hakrach shishat tvachim, till the circumference of the coil meets the 6 handbreadths requirement, shahu rochav ha'or, which then becomes the same length as the height, the thickness of the parchment. Umoded b'chut shel shani, you should use, the Rambam gives you a recommendation, you should use, they call it here, a silk cord. Apparently silk doesn't stretch. Because, if you have a little string, you start stretching it. Oh, yeah, it is 6 tefachim. You kind of make them meet, you force them to meet. But if you have a silk cord, it doesn't stretch. So it tells you the actual measurement. She'akifo al akrach, which you wrap over the coil. So here you see that I'm describing it, this way. It all becomes one big coil, not this way. Make it all one big thing. Make it meet the 6 tefachim to the 6 tefachim circumference. Now you have the parchment. You haven't written anything, but you know what you have to write on. You got to write it on all of this. Then you should make a measuring stick, a ruler, what we call today. Make it 40 or 50 finger breadths long. Then choose one of the finger breadths, mark them like a ruler, and then in one of them mark a half, mark a third, mark a quarter, so you have all the measurements: 1 finger breadth, a half a finger breadth, a quarter, and a third. So you can know what's a half a finger breadth, what's a quarter, and other measurements the like. Then you unroll this coil that you have and measure every single parchment till you figure out how many finger breadths are in every single piece of parchment. Till you now figure out how much there is in the entire coil. So now you know that the width, the height of it is always going to be 6 tefachim, and you now also know the length of your Torah, your personalized Torah scroll. You haven't written anything yet, you just know how many etzbaot there are. Now says the Rambam halacha hey. You can't start writing yet because you haven't figured out, you haven't done a test run yet. So now you have to do an experiment. Halacha hey. Take another 2-3 pieces of parchment, livdok bahen shiur haktav, to experiment, to test the size of your writing, because everybody writes differently. The kotev bahen daf echad, and you write 1 column, a test column. And today you can take a scribe hours to write 1 test column. I'm saying just do a test column, just because you're going to have to figure it out. So you do a test column. What's a test column? Test column is to see if this is your average column. Figure out now how long it's going to take you to write the entire Torah. V'davar yadua. Now we do know a couple of things. Here's what we know. She'orech hadaf 17 etzbaot. I don't care how thick you write, but the height of your column can only be 17 finger breadths, because you have 3 on top, 4 on bottom, and a total of 24. So it's 24 minus 7 is 17. You're leaving a margin of the top 3, bottom 4. So the length, the height of the column will always be 17 etzbaot. But the thickness, the width of the column is going to depend according to your writing. You make thin writing, you make thick writing. The number of lines you can fit in this column, that's up to you. All we know is there's a rule: between every line there has to be the size of a line. But you write big lines, small lines, that depends on your hand. They're going to come according to the writing. Because all we have is one rule: between every line there has to be the size of a line. How big your lines are, you get to choose. After you write the column which you tested according to how you want to write, whatever your hand produces, now use your ruler and measure how thick did this, how wide did this column come out to be. Then in your own head, add 2 more finger breadths, because there has to be 1 on each side per column. ויחשוב כמה דפים יבואו בכרך שגלל מאותו הכתב שבדק בו. And I calculate proportionally. You know how long your entire coil is. If each column now is 7 etzbaot in total, 5 for the writing and 2 on each side, now figure out how many columns can I make on this long coil that I have. If I have 1,000 etzbaot, whatever it's going to fit. וידע חשבון הדפים. Automatically you're going to figure out the number of columns you can fit. ויראה כמה נכתב בדף זה שבדק בו מן התורה כולה. There's so much estimation here because there's so much guesswork because we don't have a standardized text, so you have to just guess. You know how many columns you can fit. Let's say you can fit 210 columns. Okay, let's just put out a random number. According to the test column which you wrote and the number of length that you have of parchment, you're going to fit 210. Now go figure out how long a Torah scroll is in your head, or look at another Torah scroll, and see, based on how much I managed to write in this one column, you estimate based on the book that you're using to write from, because you can't write a Torah scroll by heart. You have to be using a manuscript. So you look at the other Torah, you say, look, I managed to fit so much and so much. I figure it's going to take me however many columns it's going to take me. And now you calculate. If you're lucky, and your estimate tells you that the entire Torah will fit in the number of columns that you have in this coil of parchment, based on the writing that you're writing, mutav, very good. But if the calculation reveals that there are more columns than we'll take for the Torah, you have more parchment than you need. And if you cut off parchment now, you're going to lose the orkok hakefo. You made the coil to fit the exact measurements.
Yeah, but you can cut the length.
But don't forget, if you cut off from the bottom, then your column is going to become shorter also, because you have to leave three finger breadths on top, 4 on the bottom. So then your column gets shorter, then the Torah will get longer. The ratio is going to change. It's always, you have to, you got to stay with the ratio. So what happens is, if based on your...
That's just a test column. So
Oh, okay, very good. Very good. That's what he's saying. So adjust your test column. Very good. That's right. That's what he's going to say. If the calculation reveals that there's more columns that you have in your parchment than will be required for the whole Torah, what you should do is, yarchiv baktav means in your test column, write the column larger. Don't make the actual script bigger. Some commentators explain that it doesn't make sense. You just make your test column wider. Make your test column wider means you're going to require less columns to fit the Torah. Ad sheyitma'et miyan adapim. V'yivdok b'daf acher. But you'll have to go through the whole thing again. You'll test another column and figure out if it works. V'yimotziach cheshbon, if the calculation revealed Shahat Torah yater min adapim, that actually in your coil there's too little. The Torah is going to take longer than the amount of columns that you have in your scroll. Yema'et haktav. So what you have to do is make the column smaller, not the script smaller. You have to make your test column smaller, ad sheyarbeh b'minyan adapim, which will allow for more columns, and now the Torah will fit into more columns.
If you expand the column, it doesn't affect the space that's left, like to the edge of
each piece?
Yeah.
So Rambam will explain soon. What happens is you just, once you have your coil, you can later on cut off edges of parchment as you need and then just add, as long as you know that it fits into this length. Understand?
Right.
No,
But you don't want to get too fat. If it gets too fat, then it doesn't.
No, because you're never gonna cross the amount of parchment that you have. Each piece of parchment might get shorter and longer, because let's say you can only fit 3 columns onto a parchment and there's this massive space. You have to cut off a piece of parchment. But at the end, you're going to add that on another piece. So you can never lose the proportion. You check column after column, till the calculation becomes 1. Now this word, really the halacha should split, and halacha zayin should begin here. Once you've figured out your test column, how wide it should be, and the amount of writing that it takes per column, now you begin writing. Start from the beginning, write your Torah. You split each parchment into columns with ruled lines, and you use the exact same amount as your test column, according to the width of the column which you used to check and came out to you in a good calculation. If on one piece of parchment you're going to end up having some extra space, your test column is 5 etzbaot. Your piece of parchment is only 25. So you put 5, 10, 15, 20, then you have 2 in between or whatever it is. Now you have extra space, you got to cut it off. Yaniach mimenu rochav etzba'o kedei tfira. Leave enough of a finger breadth and enough to sew that piece of parchment. V'yakot hashar. Cut off the rest of this piece. V'al yachush sheba'acharona yitosef. V'al yachush, don't worry. Sheba'acharona, because in the end, yitosef orot acherot ala krach shagalal, you're going to add more pieces of parchment on this coil which you rolled, kineged kol hatosafot shekotzetz mikol or va'or, commensurate with all the additions that you cut off from every piece of parchment. You don't have to even calculate it. The script will pull these extra columns in according to however number of columns you're required. As long as I have enough parchment to cover this amount of finger breadths, I'll cut off a piece over here, I'll add it on later, it's all going to come back to the same amount. Now I gave you all for the standard, to be able to fit the 6 tefachim requirement. But if you want to make the height of your Torah scroll should be more than 6 tefachim or less than 6 tefachim, you just follow the same recipe, and you will get this idealized version of a Torah scroll where the length is like the circumference, no less and no more. Of course, I can't guarantee people don't make mistakes in mathematics. If you calculate your arithmetic properly, it's going to come out good. So you always start off according to the Rambam's version. You can never just start writing a Torah. You have to always have all the parchment that you need first, roll it up, make a test, 3 tests until you figure it out, and then you get your number. Halakha tet, general rule. Rochav hagudal ha'amur b'chol ha'shiurin ha'elu u'b'shar shiurei Torah kula. Whenever I use the word thumb breadth, what is the exact width of that? In all these amounts, and in the whole Torah, when we say it, what do we mean? Hu etzba ha'benoni. Other texts have hu gudal ha'benoni. Or agudal. It's the average thumb. Ukvar dikdaknu b'shiuro, says the Rambam, we've already spent a lot of time figuring out exactly how big the etzba is. Umitzanuhu rachav sheva seorot benoniot. It's the width of 7 average barley corns. Zu b'tzad zu bedochak. When you press them one against the other, vehin keorech shtei seorot berevach, which is the length of 2 barley corns if you leave them not compact. That's how the Rambam chose to describe it. We didn't have these, spatial numbers of inches and centimeters and all this stuff. It says take 7 average seorot, squeeze them till they can't squeeze any further. That's an etzba.
How much does that turn into? Like
So
centimeters?
today it's a big argument. I have the numbers over here.
How can you have 7 squashed together that are equal to 2 that are not squashed together? Barley corns are not that big.
It's somewhere between 2 and 2.4 centimeters. Is each etzba, yeah. B'chol tefach ha'amur b'chol makom hu arba etzbaot mizu. Every tefach, when Torah says hand breadth, it means 4 of these finger breadths. B'chol ama, every time we say cubit, is shishat tefachim, it's 6 hand breadths.
It's actually a good measurement to thumb because it doesn't change that much of a millennia.
But you also have different sizes. This guy's thumb is bigger than that guy's, right? There's a fat thumb, a thin thumb. You average it, right? So you have to always end up averaging it, and that's what you get.
You're an average guy, you can call
Is
it
it,
an
what
A.
is it? Is it this the last piece of that's after this knuckle or it's the whole thumb?
It's the thickness. The thickest point like at the joint.
And then to the front.
Huh? No, it's this way.
Oh, it's
The width.
like that.
Is that what I'm saying? Yes, exactly. That way.
That's less than an inch.
Huh?
Part of it less than an inch.
You know what
on
it's
my
like,
thumb.
This is less than an inch on your thumb?
Yeah, for sure.
I think on my thumb it's about an inch. It's hard to say. You know what I mean? This is why you have so many arguments.
Shalom is 5 feet.
See, different guys have different things.
Yeah, no, he's got like those on hands. Those are.
Says the Rambam Halacha Yud, Sefer Torah shekatavti ani. Let me give you my measurement. I wrote a Torah scroll. The Rambam fulfilled this mitzvah in its ultimate form. And the Torah that I wrote, Rochav kol daf vadaf midapav, arba etzbaot. The width of every column was 4 finger breadths, except for V'shirat hayam v'shirat ha'azinu, Rochav kol daf mishtehen, shesh etzbaot. The Song of the Sea and the Song of Ha'azinu a little thicker. Look over here, you can see the picture. This is a regular column of a Torah scroll. It's pretty thin. When you get to the songs, because of the way you have to write it, it makes the column, it forces it to be thicker. So the Rambam calculated in his brain that for every regular column, it's going to be just 4. For these 2, he's going to give it more space. 6 etzbaot. Uminyan hashitin shebechol daf vadaf. In my Torah, says the Rambam, the number of lines per column, achat v'chamishim, is 51. Okay, I'll just show you on the right side. On the left side, we have the Rambam's Torah. It's 51 lines. The commentaries say because the word tov, 17 times 3, is 51. And the Torah is called tov. Lekach tov natati lachem, tov li Torah picha. Torah is called tov, so 3 times tov is 51. In all Sephardi Torahs today, Yemenite Torahs, they're all 51 lines. A Torah I showed you yesterday from the Ramchal, also 51 lines if you count it. That was a big Sephardi custom to have 51 lines. Uminyan hadapin shel kol Sefer, the total number of columns for the entire book was matayim v'shisha ve'esrim daf, 226 columns. Even till today, Yemenite Torahs and many Sephardi ones are also 226 columns. Why? Very interesting. Raku dvarav mishemen. Hashem's words are softer than oil. Raku is 226, Resh Chavav. Or it says in the Torah, Aruka me'eretz midah. The measurement of the Torah is longer than the sea, but the word Aruka has 226. And I saw, there's a Sephardi rabbi that I saw yesterday, he says, when we go to the Torah, we say, Baruch Hu Hashem Vorach. Baruch Hu could also mean 2 words. Ba, Rechu. In the Torah, there's 226. Understand? You're lifting the Torah, saying 226 columns. Very interesting.
I don't understand. Oh, there's the Rechu.
Yeah, Rechu, exactly. Reish Chavav, so it's... Anyway, so you have 226. The Orech Kol Sefer, in total, the entire book, was 1,366 b'shesh etzba'ot b'keruv, 1,366 thumb breaths. Why 1366? It should be 1360. If you did 226 times 6, and then you add another 2 for those Shat Hazino, it's 1360. What's the 6? These extra 6 finger breaths that are come out extra in the calculation, should be Sefer v'sofo. It's for the extra space in the beginning and the end of the book to wrap around the poles. The skin that I used for writing the Torah, orot elim, was ram skins. If you're going to want to write based on these measurements, or close to them, even if it's missing 1 or 2 or 3 columns, or 1 or 2 or 3 extra columns, you won't have to work. You won't need any calculations. It's going to come to you, length like circumference, it's going to be beautiful. Like I said before, the Hagahot Maimonides, he writes, I tried to do what the Rambam says and it didn't come out for me. I guess the parchment is a little thicker, a little thinner. Anyway, today's Torah scrolls are very different. Today, we don't have 51 lines, we have only 42 lines per column. Your average Torah is 42. It says in Tehillim, Hashem bam Sinai bakodesh. Hashem revealed himself in them. On Sinai, in them is 42. And your average Torah, again, has 245 columns. Not 226, 245. Some people connect it to Bnei Yisrael Yotzim Biyad Rama. Rama is Reish Mem Hey. Also in the Shema, from Shema till Emet, is 245 words. So it connects to the idea of a Torah scroll. And also there's a big difference in the number. You asked before how many parchments go into the Torah scroll. The Rambam writes elsewhere, not over here, and till today, I believe many Taimani Torahs are like this, they do 57 pieces of parchment. That's how they do it. 57 different pieces.
Today?
No, today standard is 62. Standard Torah has 62 pieces of parchment. Huh? The one that you have in the back? Yeah. Yeah, because it's written, it's a Sephardi Torah, but it's written according to the standardized way of today, where on top of every page is a Vav. You know, that there's a siman that says Vavei HaAmudim. In the Mishkan, there was hooks that went on the poles called Vavei HaAmudim. But the Chida writes that Vavei HaAmudim means every column in the Torah should begin with a Vav. I actually have it over here. You can see. If we roll it out, you can see how every column starts with a Vav. Yeah, look. Top of every column. With a couple of exceptions. Like over here you have Chamisha. That's because there are some traditions about it, different ones. But typically it's Vav. Vav, it's called Vavei HaAmudim. You can even roll it out, you see. Always a Vav. In the Rambam's Torah, in the Yemenite Torah, they have a different rule. They say that every single column should end with the end of a pasuk. Besof pasuk. We don't do that, that's not in our Torahs, but in the Yemenite Torahs till today, they end every verse with a sof pasuk. So the Sephardi Torah we have in the back, that's not written that way. It's written this way. That's why they follow the Vavei HaAmudim, so they have 245, but it's a bit of a different tradition. Anyway, that's an interesting fact.
Also, the parchment you get today, every piece is exactly the same thickness.
That's right. They're able to process it. They're able to do all kinds of much more, and it's much more beneficial. It's much easier, exactly, because everything is processed.
So they must have it down to a
Huh? It's pretty much down to a formula. But you should know it's very recent. Up to 40, 50 years ago, the stuff didn't exist. There's no computer programming and all this stuff. It didn't. Yeah.
So like the little one we've got in the
Yeah, little one got it here is also 42 lines.
So that's also
It's exactly the same.
Yeah,
Smaller writing, but it's the same measurements.
Computer and see how big the writing should be so that it fits into
Absolutely.
less of a
Absolutely.
size. And then you
It's all,
print it out,
and then you got it.
and you see, okay, I can't go bigger than this or smaller than that.
Exactly it. It's exactly it. Halacha Yud Bet. En osin ba'iriyah pachot mishlosha dapin v'lo yater al shmona dapin. There's a rule. Every piece of parchment can have no less than 3 columns on it and no more than 8. Nizdamna lo yiriyah batisha dapin. You found a fat cow, massive piece of parchment. You can write 9 columns on a piece of parchment. No. Cholekota, you have to split it. Arba'a lekan v'chamisha lekan. 4 here, 5 there. B'medvarim amurim. When are we talking about there has to be no less than 3? B'tchilat haSefer or ba'emtza, in the beginning or the middle of the book. But b'sof haSefer, but when it comes to the end of the scroll, afilu pasuk echad, b'daf echad, osim oto daf levado. Even if you have the last verse and it has to fit on one column, you can put it on a separate piece of parchment. V'tofrin oto im shara yiriyot, and you sew it with the rest of the pieces. Halacha Yud Gimel ukeshetofrin yiriyot. When we sew up the pieces of parchment, ein tofrin otan ela begidim shel behema o chayat Torah. Let's take a look at this again. You can see it over here. This sewing, it's not thread. It's actual animal sinews. You can feel it over here.
It's like the hair of an animal or skin.
It's the sinews. It's like the inner veins. Gidim, yeah. You got it over here. They sew it up with this. Huh?
Fishing wire, it's like fishing wire.
Yeah, it's kind of like fishing wire.
No, it's polyester.
Rabbi Tedabam gave me some the other day.
In the old days,
I should have brought them down. So they have to be done from sinews shel behema or chayat tehora. It has to be kosher animals or beasts sinews. Va'afilu min nevelot u'trifot shelahan, even if they're dead, even if they died from a mortal wound, they don't have to be slaughtered. They have to be kosher animals. The same way we sew the tefillin. This is a halacha from Moshe on Mount Sinai. Straight from him that we have to do this. If you sew them without using these sinews, or a non-kosher animal, pasul, it's disqualified. So you undo it and you tie it again like the law is. Halacha Yudal says the Rambam another law. Kisha tofrin kol ha'yiriyot. When we sew the parchments, ein tofrin kol ha'yiriyah kula mitchilata v'ad sofa. We don't sew the whole thing top to bottom. You see, there's always some space on the top that's unsewn. Why? Because otherwise it can rip. Ela maniach ma'at milemala u'ma'at milemata below tfira. You leave a little bit on top, a little bit on bottom without being sewn. Kedei shalot tikara ha'yiriyah be'emtza'ah kishi yigolota. So when you roll it tight, the pressure won't force the middle to rip. That's on the rest of the Torah. Then you make 2 poles of wood in the 2 edges. You sew the skin that you left in the beginning and the end onto the poles with these gidim, so you can roll onto them. And you have to distance yourself between the columns and the writing. I wonder if I can show you this.
Yeah, I've seen that before. What they do is they drill holes into the wood.
Yeah.
Those cylindrical pieces.
Can you see this? Oh, here you go.
And then they sew it into the holes.
Okay, so this. He shows you how he sews it up. It's quite cool, actually. Okay. Halakha Tedvav. Sefer Torah shenikra bo yiriyah. What happens if you have a Torah scroll where the parchment ripped? Now, we don't mean ripped over here. We actually mean torn, literally. Someone was doing Hagbah and the whole thing ripped. So it goes like this. Betoch shtei shitot, if it went 2 lines into the writing, every column has a bunch of lines, you go 2 lines into the writing, yitpor, you can sew it up. Betoch shalosh lo yitpor. But if it went 3 lines in, you can sew it up. You take out this whole piece. You have to rewrite it.
That's assuming that none of the letters were damaged.
Well, let's see. When do we say this? If it's an old scroll, she'ein aftzon ikar, where you can't tell how it was processed with gallnut juice. But if you can still see the processing on the parchment, tofer va'afilu kara haba betoch shalosh. You can sew up even a tear that went 3 lines in. Needless to say, if there's parchment ripped over here between the columns, so no letters actually got ripped, or if luckily your rip went down between the letters, doesn't matter how deep it goes, you can sew it back up. The whole law of 2-3 lines is if the actual word's ripped. And the Rambam says, "V'chol hakra'im ein tofrinotam ela begidin shetofrin b'hanayot zu lezu." Okay, when you sew it up, you have to sew it up with the same sinews that you use. U'b'chol hakra'im yizaher shelo techsar ot achat o tishtaneh tzurata. When you sew it up, you have to be careful that you're not ruining any of the forms of the letters. But technically, even if the letter's ripped and you sew them back up together, it's fine. As long as you can still tell that it's a tzaddik or a gimel or a vav, then you're good.